The cruelest betrayal is never delivered by strangers. It comes from the people who once promised to protect you. Isabella Bennet stood silently in the center of her family's meeting hall while the cold autumn rain tapped against the tall windows surrounding her. At only 23 years old, she had already learned that loyalty could disappear the moment fear entered a person's heart. 3 men stood before her, each wearing the crest of the Silver Ridge Pack. They were not enemies. They were her older brothers, the only family she had left after their parents passed away years earlier. Yet none of them could meet her eyes as the ancient treaty rested upon the heavy oak table between them. The neighboring Shadow Crest Pack had demanded peace after years of bitter conflict that had exhausted both territories. Harvests had failed. Trade had nearly stopped. Every council meeting ended with the same warning that another season of hatred would destroy both packs. Then a proposal arrived that changed everything. Shadow Crest requested a single Omega from the Bennet family as a symbol of permanent peace. Isabella had never imagined that her own brothers would agree without asking what she wanted. The eldest brother slowly pushed the parchment toward her. His voice remained steady, but it carried the weight of quiet guilt. This is the only way to save our people. Isabella looked down at the treaty without touching it. Or the easiest way to save yourselves, she answered softly. Silence filled the room. No one denied her words. The second brother finally spoke. You do not understand the danger we face. Isabella lifted her eyes toward him. Perhaps I understand it better than any of you. You are asking your sister to leave everything she has ever known because you believe strangers deserve my future more than I do. The youngest brother lowered his head, unable to speak. He had always protected Isabella when they were children, but now fear had become stronger than courage. The family elder quietly placed a ceremonial pin beside the treaty. Once the agreement is signed, the Shadow Crest Pack will arrive before sunset. Isabella stared at the empty space prepared for her signature. She knew refusing would only place more pressure upon innocent people who had no voice in the conflict. With calm hands and tearless eyes, she signed her name. The scratching sound of ink against parchment echoed through the silent hall, like the closing of a chapter she had never wanted to end. Outside, villagers watched from a distance as news spread through the pack. Some whispered that the enemy pack would treat her as a prisoner. Others believed she would never be seen again. No one imagined a hopeful future waiting beyond the mountains. Hours later, a black royal carriage bearing the crest of Shadow Crest crossed the stone bridge leading toward the Bennet estate. Elite royal guards stepped down first, disciplined and respectful rather than threatening. Finally, one dignified royal steward approached the entrance and bowed with perfect courtesy. Lady Isabella Bennet, he said gently, the Alpha King welcomes you to Shadow Crest. Those unexpected words startled everyone standing in the courtyard. There was no arrogance, no mockery, no triumph, only quiet respect. Isabella glanced back one final time at the brothers who had chosen duty over family. None of them stepped forward to stop her. None asked her to stay. With steady determination, she climbed into the waiting carriage, believing she was leaving her home forever. As the horses carried her toward the distant mountains where the enemy pack ruled beneath ancient forests and towering castles, Isabella closed her eyes and prepared herself for a future filled with uncertainty. Far beyond the border, inside the highest tower of Shadow Crest Castle, Alpha King Ethan Carter stood beside an open window overlooking the winding mountain road. For years, the same mysterious young woman had appeared in his dreams beneath the light of every full moon. Today, without anyone realizing why, his heart told him that she was finally coming home. The journey to Shadow Crest lasted through the fading afternoon as the royal carriage followed a winding mountain road lined with towering pine trees and silver rivers that reflected the autumn sky. Isabella Bennet sat quietly beside the window, watching her homeland slowly disappear behind distant hills until even the familiar outline of Silver Ridge could no longer be seen. She expected every passing mile to bring her closer to fear, humiliation, and a future controlled by strangers. Throughout her childhood, every story about Shadow Crest Pack had painted the same terrifying picture. They were ruthless. They were cold. They never forgave old enemies. As the horses continued climbing into the northern mountains, Isabella silently prepared herself for whatever awaited beyond the border. Surprisingly, the royal guards escorting her remained respectful during the entire journey. Whenever the carriage paused beside mountain springs to rest the horses, one guard politely offered her fresh water, while another quietly placed a warm blanket beside her when the evening air became colder. No one mocked her. No one treated her as a prisoner. The unexpected kindness only deepened her confusion. She wondered whether this was merely a performance that would disappear the moment they reached the castle. Just before sunset, the road curved around a towering cliff, revealing Shadow Crest Castle for the first time. Isabella could not hide her surprise. The fortress rose above the mountains like something from an ancient legend, its stone towers reaching toward the glowing sky while elegant bridges connected magnificent walls overlooking crystal lakes below. Hundreds of lanterns already illuminated the outer courtyards as banners bearing the silver wolf crest moved gently in the cool wind. Instead of looking like the fortress of merciless enemies, the castle appeared peaceful, proud, and remarkably alive. Villagers walked through the nearby streets carrying baskets of fresh bread and autumn vegetables, while children laughed beneath rows of colorful lanterns. Life continued with calm normality rather than fear. As the carriage crossed the final bridge, large wooden gates slowly opened without dramatic fanfare. Rows of royal guards stood at attention in polished ceremonial armor, not with threatening expressions, but with disciplined respect. Castle servants lined the entrance wearing formal uniforms, while musicians quietly performed gentle melodies that echoed across the courtyard. Isabella stepped down from the carriage expecting suspicious stares. Instead, every person respectfully bowed their head as she passed. The elderly royal steward who had escorted her from Silver Ridge smiled kindly. "Welcome to Shadow Crest Castle, Lady Isabella. His Majesty has prepared everything for your arrival." Isabella looked around in complete disbelief. "Why is everyone treating me this way?" she quietly asked. The steward simply answered, "Because that is how our king instructed us to welcome you." Before she could ask another question, the enormous entrance doors slowly opened. The grand hall stretched before her beneath soaring ceilings supported by ancient stone columns. Warm firelight danced across polished marble floors while elegant stained glass windows reflected the final colors of sunset. At the far end of the hall stood a single man, wearing a black ceremonial uniform embroidered with silver thread. His posture reflected quiet authority rather than intimidation. His dark hair framed calm blue eyes that remained fixed upon Isabella from the moment she entered. Alpha King Ethan Carter took one measured step forward. For several silent seconds, neither of them spoke. Isabella expected judgment from the ruler of the pack. She had been taught to fear her entire life. Instead, Ethan looked at her with unmistakable recognition, as though he had finally found someone he had spent years searching for. His normally composed expression softened almost imperceptibly before he bowed his head with genuine respect. "Welcome home, Lady Isabella," he said quietly. The words struck her heart more deeply than any threat ever could because nothing in the story she had believed had prepared her for an enemy king who greeted her as though she had always belonged there. Isabella Bennet remained standing in the grand hall long after Alpha King Ethan Carter welcomed her with those unexpected words. She searched his face for mockery, hidden satisfaction, or even quiet pity, yet she found none of them. His calm blue eyes reflected only sincerity, as though her arrival fulfilled a promise that had existed long before either of them spoke a single word. Unsure how to respond, Isabella lowered her gaze respectfully. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I do not understand why you are treating me with such kindness. I was sent here because my own family believed peace required a sacrifice." Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he answered with a quiet certainty that surprised everyone present. "You were never brought here as a sacrifice." The words echoed gently through the enormous hall. Before Isabella could ask what he meant, Ethan gestured toward the elderly royal steward. "Please escort Lady Isabella to the eastern residence. It has been prepared according to my instructions." Isabella expected to be taken toward a servant's chamber or a guarded guest room, but instead she followed the steward through elegant corridors decorated with centuries-old paintings, crystal lanterns, and polished marble floors. Castle servants greeted her respectfully wherever she walked. Some bowed politely, while others offered warm smiles before returning to their work. None of them whispered behind her back. None looked at her with suspicion. Every unexpected gesture made Isabella even more uncertain. Eventually, they reached a quiet wing overlooking the northern gardens. The steward opened carved wooden doors, revealing a beautiful private suite filled with warm sunlight from tall windows facing snow-covered mountains. Fresh flowers rested beside the fireplace. Books lined handcrafted shelves. Elegant gowns had already been prepared inside a cedar wardrobe, and a balcony overlooked peaceful forests stretching beyond the castle walls. Isabella slowly stepped inside, unable to hide her astonishment. "This cannot be for me," she whispered. The steward smiled kindly. "His Majesty personally selected every detail several weeks ago." Isabella turned toward him in confusion. "Several weeks ago? But no one knew I was coming until yesterday." The elderly man hesitated only briefly before answering carefully. "His Majesty believed you would arrive one day. He simply did not know when." Those words remained in Isabella's thoughts long after the steward quietly left. She walked slowly through every room, noticing countless thoughtful details that made the unfamiliar place feel strangely welcoming. A reading chair stood beside the window exactly where morning sunlight would fall. A collection of botanical books filled one shelf, including rare volumes about healing herbs that few people outside royal libraries ever studied. Fresh lavender rested beside the bedside table, filling the room with a calming fragrance she had loved since childhood. It felt less like a room prepared for a political hostage and more like a home carefully designed for someone deeply understood. As evening settled across Shadow Crest Castle, a gentle knock came at the door. A young palace attendant entered carrying a silver tray with warm soup, fresh bread, herbal tea, and seasonal fruit. "His Majesty asked me to make certain you enjoyed dinner before resting," she explained with a friendly smile. Isabella looked at the meal before quietly asking, "Does your king always concern himself with every guest?" The attendant smiled even wider. "No, my lady. Only one." After the attendant departed, Isabella stepped onto the balcony beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. Far below, the castle glowed with peaceful lanterns while distant laughter drifted upward from the village beyond the gates. Somewhere within the same castle, Ethan Carter stood alone inside his private study, opening an old leather journal filled with sketches of the same young woman who had appeared in his dreams beneath every full moon since he was a boy. Looking toward the balcony where Isabella now stood beneath the night sky, he quietly closed the journal and whispered to himself, "After all these years, you are finally here." Morning sunlight slowly filled the eastern wing of Shadow Crest Castle, casting warm golden light across polished stone floors and the quiet gardens beyond Isabella Bennet's balcony. For the first time in many months, she had slept through the entire night without waking to anxious thoughts, yet the unfamiliar comfort surrounding her only created new questions she could not answer. She dressed in one of the elegant gowns prepared inside the wardrobe, choosing the simplest pale blue design because she did not wish to appear as though she belonged in a place she still considered temporary. When she stepped into the hallway, a young palace attendant greeted her with a cheerful smile. "Good morning, Lady Isabella. His Majesty asked that you enjoy breakfast in the Sun Garden if the weather was pleasant." Isabella hesitated before quietly asking, "Does your king always arrange the schedules of his guests?" The attendant answered honestly, "No, my lady. His Majesty rarely has time for such things." That reply only deepened Isabella's confusion. She followed the attendant through graceful corridors decorated with centuries-old artwork until they reached a peaceful courtyard surrounded by flowering vines and crystal fountains. Birds sang among blooming trees while the scent of fresh bread and mountain herbs drifted gently through the morning air. A breakfast table had been prepared beneath an ancient oak tree overlooking the valley below. Moments later, Alpha King Ethan Carter entered the garden wearing simple royal clothing rather than formal ceremonial attire. Without guards crowding around him or grand announcements accompanying his arrival, he appeared more like an ordinary man enjoying the quiet beginning of a new day. He greeted Isabella with the same respectful nod he had offered the previous evening before taking a seat across from her. "I hope you rested well," he said calmly. Isabella looked directly at him for the first time since arriving at the castle. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "That is what surprises me." Ethan smiled faintly. "Because you expected your enemy to treat you differently." Isabella lowered her eyes toward the steaming cup of herbal tea placed before her. Everything I believed about Shadow Crest has been challenged in less than one day. Ethan studied the gardens for a brief moment before replying. Sometimes the longest wars are built upon stories that no one ever questions. His answer lingered in Isabella's thoughts as they shared breakfast in comfortable silence. There was no pressure to speak, no attempt to demand gratitude, and no expectation that she should immediately trust him. After the meal, Ethan invited her to walk through the castle grounds. As they passed training fields, merchants, artisans, and families greeted their king with genuine affection rather than fear. Children waved enthusiastically, elderly villagers smiled warmly, and every greeting Ethan returned carried quiet humility instead of royal pride. Isabella noticed that he knew many people by name and frequently paused to ask about their families or harvests. Nothing about the ruler matched the image she had carried since childhood. While they crossed an elevated stone bridge overlooking the northern gardens, a sudden autumn breeze carried several white flower petals through the air. One landed gently in Isabella's hand. Ethan looked at the flower with unmistakable recognition before softly saying, "Moon lilies only bloom when important journeys begin." Isabella glanced at him curiously. "You speak as though you have been expecting this moment." Ethan remained silent for several heartbeats before answering with careful honesty. "Perhaps I have been waiting far longer than you could imagine." Before Isabella could ask what he meant, the castle bells echoed across the valley, announcing the arrival of members of the royal council. Ethan's expression became thoughtful as he turned toward the grand hall, knowing that questions he had avoided for years could not remain hidden forever. The royal council gathered inside the circular chamber overlooking the northern mountains while morning clouds drifted slowly across the valley beyond the towering windows. Isabella Bennet remained just outside the open doors with the elderly steward, uncertain whether she should enter. She had never expected to witness the leadership of the very pack she had been taught to fear. Through the doorway, she could hear calm voices discussing harvest routes, trade agreements, and preparations for the approaching winter. There were no angry arguments or calls for revenge against neighboring packs. Instead, every discussion centered upon protecting families and preserving peace. Ethan Carter sat at the head of the long stone table, listening carefully before offering thoughtful decisions rather than issuing commands. His quiet confidence earned the respect of every council member. After the meeting concluded, several elders noticed Isabella waiting in the hallway. To her surprise, each one greeted her with sincere courtesy. One elderly councilwoman smiled warmly and said, "We have heard wonderful things about your knowledge of healing herbs. Shadow Crest has always respected those who bring hope instead of fear." Isabella thanked her politely, still unable to understand why everyone already seemed to know so much about her. As the council members departed, Ethan approached with his usual calm expression. "Would you like to see another part of the castle?" he asked. Isabella nodded, grateful for the chance to escape the growing mystery surrounding her arrival. Together they walked through quiet corridors until they reached the royal library, a magnificent chamber stretching across 2 floors with thousands of carefully preserved books resting upon handcrafted wooden shelves. Sunlight filtered through tall stained glass windows, filling the room with warm colors that danced across polished floors. Isabella slowly wandered between the shelves, amazed by rare botanical collections she had only dreamed of reading. She gently removed one beautifully bound volume describing mountain herbs native to the northern forests. Before she could open it, Ethan quietly said, "I thought you might choose that one first." Isabella looked at him in surprise. "How could you know?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Some choices simply feel familiar." His answer only deepened the questions already filling her mind. Later that afternoon, while Ethan stepped away to meet a messenger, Isabella continued exploring the library alone. As she reached a quiet corner rarely visited by others, she noticed a partially open door leading into a smaller reading room. Curiosity drew her forward. Inside stood an elegant writing desk, several leather journals, and shelves containing carefully preserved scrolls. Nothing appeared unusual until her eyes settled upon a framed charcoal sketch resting beside the window. Her breath caught instantly. The young woman in the drawing looked remarkably like her. The hairstyle, the gentle expression, even the small pendant around the woman's neck matched the one Isabella had worn since childhood. Confused, she carefully picked up the frame. The paper showed signs of age, suggesting it had been created many years earlier. Before she could examine it further, soft footsteps approached from the hallway. Ethan entered the room and stopped immediately when he saw the sketch in her hands. For the first time since they had met, genuine surprise crossed his face. Neither of them spoke for several long moments. Isabella finally looked up at him with quiet disbelief. "Why does this woman look exactly like me?" she asked. Ethan slowly walked closer, his expression filled not with fear, but with the weight of a truth he had protected for many years. Looking at the old drawing and then back into Isabella's searching eyes, he answered softly, "Because I drew her long before I ever knew your name." Isabella Bennet stood motionless inside the quiet reading room while the charcoal sketch remained in her hands. The silence between her and Ethan Carter felt heavier than any explanation either of them could immediately offer. She carefully placed the framed drawing back upon the desk before looking directly into his eyes. "You said you drew this before you knew my name," she whispered. "That is impossible." Ethan slowly approached the window where soft afternoon sunlight illuminated the old journals resting beside the sketch. His expression remained calm, yet there was unmistakable emotion beneath his composed voice. "I believed it was impossible as well," he admitted. "For years I told no one because I feared they would believe I had imagined everything." Isabella folded her hands together, uncertain whether to leave or remain. Curiosity finally overcame caution. "Then tell me the truth." Ethan opened the top drawer of the writing desk and carefully removed a worn leather journal whose edges had faded with age. He carried it toward her with remarkable care, as though it contained something priceless. "These are my personal journals. I began writing them when I was 16 years old." Isabella accepted the book with hesitant hands. As she opened the first pages, she discovered detailed sketches of forests, moonlit lakes, mountain paths, and beside them appeared the same young woman again and again. Sometimes she stood beneath a full moon surrounded by blooming white lilies. Sometimes she smiled while holding healing herbs. Other pages contained only brief handwritten entries. Isabella quietly read one dated nearly 9 years earlier. "She appeared again tonight beneath the ancient tree. I still do not know her name, but every dream feels more real than the last." She turned another page. "The mysterious girl warned me not to lose hope. I woke before hearing her voice clearly." Another entry followed months later. "I searched neighboring territories hoping she truly existed. No one recognized her face." Isabella slowly looked up from the journal. "You search for someone from your dreams." Ethan nodded without embarrassment. Every full moon brought the same dream. The seasons changed. The years passed. Yet she never disappeared. He walked toward the bookshelf where dozens of carefully organized journals filled an entire shelf. "Eventually, I stopped asking whether the dreams were real. I simply accepted that one day I might understand why they had been given to me." Isabella carefully opened another journal written only a year earlier. A new sketch immediately caught her attention. This time the young woman wore a small silver pendant identical to the one resting around Isabella's own neck. She instinctively touched it with trembling fingers. "How could you know about this?" she asked softly. Ethan answered with complete honesty. "I have never seen that pendant anywhere except in my dreams." Isabella felt a quiet chill despite the warmth of the room. Throughout her childhood, her late mother had told her never to remove the pendant because it had belonged to generations of women in their family. No outsider should have known it even existed. Before either of them could continue, gentle footsteps echoed outside the reading room. Elder Miriam, the oldest advisor within Shadowcrest, appeared in the doorway. She looked from Isabella to the journals before offering a knowing smile that carried neither surprise nor concern. "It seems," she said gently, "that the moon goddess has decided the time for hidden truths has finally arrived." Isabella looked between the elderly advisor and Ethan, realizing that the answers she had searched for since crossing the border were only beginning to unfold, and that her arrival at Shadowcrest had never been the accident she once believed it to be. After Elder Miriam quietly closed the reading room door behind her, the atmosphere became even more peaceful, as though the ancient castle itself had been waiting for this conversation to unfold. Isabella Bennet looked once more at the shelves filled with Ethan Carter's journals before turning toward the elderly advisor. "You knew about these dreams?" she asked gently. Elder Miriam smiled with the calm patience that only many decades of wisdom could bring. Not at the beginning, she replied. His Majesty kept them hidden for years because he believed no one would understand. Eventually, he trusted me enough to share what he had experienced. Isabella lowered her eyes toward the leather journal still resting in her hands. And you believed him? Elder Miriam nodded without hesitation. I believed the sincerity in his heart. Whether dreams come from memory, hope, or the moon goddess herself, they should never be dismissed when they continue guiding someone toward compassion instead of fear. Ethan remained silent, allowing the elder to speak freely. He had spent years trying to explain something even he could barely understand. Elder Miriam slowly walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking the mountains. There are stories preserved within the oldest records of every great pack, she continued. Very rarely, two souls are shown fragments of one another long before destiny allows them to meet. These visions are not commands. They are invitations. Both people remain free to choose their own path. Isabella listened carefully. The explanation sounded impossible, yet every page she had read moments earlier existed before her arrival at Shadow Crest. No one could have created those sketches after learning her name. She gently touched the silver pendant around her neck once again. My mother always told me this pendant carried an old family blessing, she whispered. She never explained anything more. Elder Miriam looked at the pendant with quiet recognition. Your mother was wiser than you realized. Ethan finally stepped closer. I never searched for you because I wished to possess a dream, he said honestly. I searched because every dream reminded me to become a better leader before the day we finally met. Whenever I felt anger or frustration, I remembered the peaceful woman standing beneath the moon. She always seemed to believe there was another way forward. Isabella looked into his eyes, searching for even the smallest sign of deception. She found none. Instead, she saw years of loneliness carried with remarkable humility. All this time, she asked softly, you never knew whether I truly existed? Ethan smiled gently. No. There were moments when I convinced myself I had imagined everything. Then another full moon would come, and I would see you again. The afternoon light slowly faded as golden sunlight gave way to the soft colors of evening. Elder Miriam quietly excused herself, leaving the two of them alone beside the library windows. Neither felt the need to rush the silence. For the first time since leaving Silver Ridge, Isabella no longer felt like someone who had been traded between rival packs. Instead, she felt as though she had unexpectedly stepped into a story that had begun long before her own memories. As they walked together through the quiet library toward the castle gardens, the first evening stars appeared above the mountains. Neither of them noticed that far beyond the border, inside the council chamber of Silver Ridge, Isabella's oldest brother had just received troubling news from a traveling merchant. The merchant calmly reported that the young woman they believed had been delivered into suffering was instead being welcomed throughout Shadow Crest Castle with honor, respect, and the quiet dignity reserved only for someone of extraordinary importance. The following morning arrived beneath a sky of brilliant blue, and Shadow Crest Castle seemed even more peaceful than it had the day before. Isabella Bennet slowly discovered that every hour she spent within the Mountain Kingdom challenged another belief she had carried since childhood. She expected suspicious glances from servants, resentment from warriors, and whispered insults from noble families, yet none of those fears became reality. Instead, the castle moved with quiet harmony. Physicians welcomed her questions about healing herbs, gardeners proudly showed her rare mountain flowers, and the kitchen staff eagerly exchanged family recipes with genuine smiles. Everywhere she went, people treated her not as a hostage from a rival pack, but as an honored guest whose comfort mattered. Even so, Isabella remained cautious. Kindness offered too quickly often carried hidden conditions, or so she had believed for many years. Late that afternoon, Ethan Carter invited her to accompany him beyond the castle walls to visit the nearby village. They traveled without an elaborate royal escort, walking through narrow stone streets where merchants arranged colorful fabrics, fresh fruit, handmade pottery, and carved wooden ornaments beneath rows of autumn lanterns. Villagers greeted Ethan warmly, and Isabella noticed something remarkable. The Alpha King stopped to speak with nearly everyone who approached him. He asked an elderly baker about his health, congratulated young apprentices for their hard work, and knelt beside two laughing children who proudly showed him a small wooden wolf they had carved together. There was no distance between ruler and people. Respect flowed naturally in both directions. Isabella quietly observed every moment, realizing that leadership could exist without fear. As they continued through the marketplace, an elderly woman carrying several heavy baskets struggled to climb a gentle stone staircase. Before any guard could react, Ethan stepped forward, lifted the baskets himself, and carried them to her front door. The grateful woman smiled and touched his arm affectionately. "Your mother would be proud of the man you became," she said softly. Ethan thanked her with humble sincerity before returning to Isabella. She looked at him with open curiosity. "You did not have to do that." Ethan answered with the same quiet honesty that had begun to define every conversation between them. A king who forgets ordinary people eventually forgets why he wears the crown. Those simple words remained with Isabella long after they left the village behind. As evening approached, they climbed a gentle hill overlooking the valley where the castle stood beneath the golden light of sunset. The wind carried the fragrance of pine trees while distant church bells echoed across the mountains. Ethan remained silent for several moments before speaking. "There is something I have never told anyone except Elder Miriam." Isabella turned toward him, sensing the importance of what he was about to reveal. "Every dream ended the same way," he said quietly. "You always stood beneath a full moon beside an ancient white tree. Before I woke, you smiled and said that fear would never build the future we were meant to protect. I never heard another sentence because I always awakened at that exact moment." Isabella felt a gentle shiver despite the warmth of the evening. The words sounded strangely familiar, awakening emotions she could not explain. Although she could not remember having those dreams herself, something deep within her heart recognized the place he described. She looked toward the distant mountains where the first silver light of the rising moon appeared above the horizon. Without understanding why, she softly whispered, "I think I have seen that tree before." Ethan looked at her in quiet astonishment, realizing that the mystery connecting their lives might be far older and far deeper than either of them had ever imagined. When Isabella Bennet and Ethan Carter returned to Shadowcrest Castle, the peaceful evening carried a quiet sense of expectation neither of them could fully explain. The conversation beside the mountain overlook lingered in Isabella's thoughts long after they entered the castle. The image of the ancient white tree refused to leave her mind, and although she could not remember ever seeing such a place, it felt strangely familiar, like a forgotten memory waiting patiently beneath the surface. That night, she found herself standing on the balcony outside her chamber, watching the moon rise above the snow-covered peaks. The silver pendant resting against her heart seemed unusually warm beneath her fingertips. For the first time since arriving at Shadowcrest, she closed her eyes without fear. Meanwhile, far beyond the northern border, concern slowly spread throughout Silver Ridge Pack. Isabella's oldest brother, Daniel Bennet, paced across the council chamber after hearing another report from merchants returning from Shadowcrest. Every traveler described the same unbelievable story. The young Omega sent away to secure peace was not living as a servant, prisoner, or political hostage. She had been given private royal quarters, welcomed by respected elders, escorted personally by the Alpha King, and treated with remarkable honor throughout the kingdom. Daniel looked toward his younger brothers, his voice filled with growing uncertainty. "Something is wrong. None of this matches what we believed about Shadowcrest." The second brother frowned thoughtfully. "Perhaps they are pretending until the treaty becomes permanent." The youngest brother remained silent. Deep inside, guilt had never left him since the day Isabella climbed into the royal carriage. He quietly remembered the look in her eyes when she realized none of her brothers would ask her to stay. Before anyone could continue the discussion, another messenger entered carrying official trade records. He respectfully placed the documents upon the table. "These were signed yesterday by Shadowcrest merchants," he explained. "Trade restrictions are already being lifted. They have also requested additional healers and botanical specialists to cooperate during the winter." Daniel stared at the documents in disbelief. If they planned revenge, why would they strengthen relations? No one in the room had an answer. At the same time inside Shadowcrest Castle, Elder Miriam met privately with Ethan in the ancient observatory overlooking the valley. Thousands of stars illuminated the sky through the circular glass ceiling, while old astronomical charts covered the stone walls. The elder spoke softly. "News has already crossed the border. Silver Ridge now realizes Lady Isabella has been welcomed with dignity. Ethan nodded calmly. Eventually they will ask why. Elder Miriam studied the full moon before replying. That question may lead them toward truths others have spent many years hiding. Ethan turned toward one of the oldest maps preserved inside the observatory. A faded illustration showed the legendary moon tree standing exactly where his dreams had always taken him. If the dreams are real, he said quietly, then someone understood their meaning long before I was born. Elder Miriam gently rested her hand upon the ancient map. Then we must discover who wished to keep that knowledge hidden. At that very moment, Isabella suddenly awakened from a vivid dream. She had seen the same white tree Ethan described, its glowing branches reaching across a moonlit meadow while an unfamiliar voice whispered only 4 words before the vision disappeared. Sitting upright in bed with her heart racing, she repeated the words aloud, barely above a whisper. Find the forgotten promise. She did not yet understand their meaning. But somewhere else within the castle, Ethan opened his eyes at precisely the same moment, realizing he had heard those exact words in his dream for the very first time. The first light of dawn had barely reached the highest towers of Shadow Crest Castle when Isabella Bennet quietly made her way to the ancient observatory. Sleep had abandoned her after the mysterious dream, and the 4 whispered words continued echoing through her thoughts with remarkable clarity. Find the forgotten promise. She had repeated them countless times throughout the night, hoping they would awaken a memory, yet they remained as mysterious as the silver pendant resting against her heart. As she stepped inside the circular chamber, she was surprised to find Ethan Carter already standing beside the enormous celestial map beneath the glass ceiling. He slowly turned toward her with a thoughtful expression before speaking. You heard them too. Isabella stopped in complete surprise. How did you know? Ethan answered quietly. Because I woke at exactly the same moment after hearing the same words for the first time in every year I have carried these dreams. Neither of them questioned whether the coincidence was possible. They had already crossed too many impossible moments together. Elder Miriam soon joined them carrying an ancient wooden chest covered with faded silver carvings. She carefully placed it upon the observatory table before unlocking it with a small iron key she wore around her neck. Inside rested fragile scrolls, weathered journals, and a beautifully preserved parchment bearing the crest of both Shadow Crest and Silver Ridge. Isabella looked at the unfamiliar symbol joining the 2 packs together. I have never seen this before, she whispered. Elder Miriam nodded gently. Very few living people have. She slowly unrolled the parchment, revealing an agreement written generations earlier. Long before the conflict between our packs, both kingdoms lived as trusted allies. The founders believed unity would protect future generations from fear and division. Ethan carefully studied the elegant handwriting. Then what changed? Elder Miriam sighed softly. Someone wanted power more than peace. She pointed toward a section that had been deliberately damaged many years earlier. Large portions of our shared history disappeared. Stories were rewritten. Children were raised believing old friends had always been enemies. Isabella felt a quiet sadness settle within her heart. So the hatred I grew up believing was carefully inherited, Elder Miriam finished gently. Before anyone could continue, a royal messenger entered the observatory carrying sealed correspondence that had just arrived from neighboring territories. Ethan accepted the letter and quickly read its contents. His expression became more serious, though never fearful. Several influential nobles are questioning the renewed friendship between the packs, he explained. Someone has begun spreading rumors that Isabella was brought here through deception and that Shadow Crest intends to dominate Silver Ridge. Isabella immediately understood what those lies could accomplish. If enough people believe them, the peace treaty could collapse before trust has a chance to grow. Ethan looked directly at her with quiet determination. Then we will answer rumors with truth. Elder Miriam smiled approvingly. Exactly as the moon goddess intended. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Isabella walked together through the village marketplace, greeting merchants, healers, craftsmen, and visiting traders from neighboring territories. Rather than hiding Isabella inside the castle, Ethan openly introduced her with dignity and respect. Every conversation reflected honesty instead of politics, kindness instead of suspicion. Travelers carried those moments beyond the borders, allowing genuine stories to spread farther than fearful rumors. As sunset painted the mountains with warm golden light, Isabella realized something extraordinary. The greatest battle before them would never be fought with swords or anger. It would be won by restoring forgotten trust, one truthful conversation at a time. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, however, a man who had quietly benefited from years of division listened carefully as news of the growing friendship reached his estate, and for the first time in many years, he began preparing a final attempt to keep the forgotten promise buried forever. 2 days later, representatives from both Shadow Crest and Silver Ridge gathered inside the magnificent Grand Council Hall, a place that had not welcomed leaders from the two packs together in nearly a generation. Sunlight streamed through towering stained-glass windows, casting brilliant colors across polished marble floors, while the banners of both kingdoms stood side by side for the first time in decades. Isabella Bennet quietly entered beside Ethan Carter, feeling the weight of history resting upon every step. Across the chamber, her three brothers waited with expressions far different from the confidence they had shown on the day they signed the treaty. Daniel Bennet looked older than she remembered, as though regret had quietly followed him every hour since her departure. None of the brothers expected forgiveness. They simply hoped to understand the truth that had remained hidden from both packs for so many years. Elder Miriam welcomed everyone before carefully placing the ancient parchment upon the central council table. Beside it rested the journals Ethan had written throughout his youth, along with historical records preserved inside the observatory. Every document pointed toward the same forgotten reality. Shadow Crest and Silver Ridge had once shared knowledge, trade, ceremonies, and generations of peaceful cooperation. The rivalry that shaped modern history had not begun naturally. It had been carefully encouraged until no one questioned it anymore. One respected historian stepped forward and revealed newly recovered correspondence written nearly 40 years earlier. The letters described how a powerful noble named Victor Ashford had secretly manipulated trade disputes, destroyed diplomatic messages, and spread false accusations between both kingdoms to increase his own influence over neighboring territories. Each misunderstanding created another layer of distrust until friendship slowly transformed into inherited hatred. Silence settled across the chamber as every leader realized how thoroughly the past had been rewritten. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor before finally speaking. "We taught our own sister to fear people who were never truly our enemies." His voice carried genuine sorrow rather than excuses. Ethan remained calm as he answered. "Fear survives when truth is forgotten. That is why we are here today." Isabella looked at her brothers for a long moment. She remembered the loneliness she had carried while leaving Silver Ridge, yet she also saw the remorse they could no longer hide. The youngest brother stepped forward first. "We believed we were saving our people," he admitted quietly. "Instead, we abandoned the person who trusted us most." Isabella felt emotion rise within her heart, but anger no longer controlled her thoughts. Shadow Crest had shown her compassion where she expected cruelty, and that kindness had changed the way she viewed both the past and the future. She spoke gently enough for everyone to hear. "We cannot rebuild tomorrow if we remain prisoners of yesterday." Her words filled the hall with thoughtful silence. Elder Miriam smiled warmly before inviting leaders from both packs to sign a declaration restoring open cooperation between their kingdoms. One by one, council members stepped forward, placing their signatures beside the ancient crest once nearly erased from history. As the final signature dried upon the parchment, sunlight illuminated the united symbols of both packs exactly as the clouds parted outside the towering windows. Ethan quietly looked toward Isabella, grateful that the woman once traded as a symbol of surrender had become the very person capable of restoring trust between generations. Yet as hope spread through the Grand Council Hall, a messenger hurried toward the chamber carrying urgent correspondence. The seal upon the letter belonged to Victor Ashford's distant estate, and the message confirmed that the man responsible for decades of deception had finally broken his silence, requesting one final audience before the truth reached the entire kingdom. The request for a final audience was accepted at sunrise, not because Ethan Carter trusted Victor Ashford, but because the truth deserved to be heard in the open rather than whispered behind closed doors. Representatives from Shadow Crest and Silver Ridge gathered once again inside the Grand Council Hall, determined to end decades of uncertainty with honesty instead of suspicion. Isabella Bennet stood beside Ethan with calm confidence, no longer feeling like the frightened Omega who had crossed the border believing she had been abandoned forever. She had discovered something far greater than safety. She had discovered the courage to face the past without allowing it to control her future. When Victor Ashford entered the chamber, he no longer carried the commanding presence that had once influenced generations of leaders. Age had softened his appearance, yet pride still lingered in his expression. He looked slowly around the hall before speaking. You believe history can simply be rewritten because you uncovered a few forgotten records. Ethan answered calmly. History does not change because we wish it to. It changes when truth finally replaces deception. Elder Miriam carefully presented the preserved treaties, personal journals, merchant records, diplomatic letters, and council archives collected from both kingdoms. Every document confirmed the same pattern. Messages encouraging cooperation had been intercepted. Trade disagreements had been deliberately exaggerated. Honest negotiations had quietly disappeared before reaching their intended recipients. For decades, fear had been carefully cultivated until every new generation accepted inherited hatred as unquestionable fact. Victor remained silent while each document was examined by historians and council members from both packs. Finally, he lowered his head. I believe divided kingdoms would always need my guidance, he admitted quietly. I convinced myself that control created stability. The chamber remained silent for several moments. Isabella looked toward the elderly noble with compassion rather than anger. Control built upon fear never lasts, she said gently. People deserve the chance to choose trust once they know the truth. Her words carried through the hall with quiet strength. Daniel Bennet slowly stepped forward beside his brothers. Facing Isabella, he struggled to find the right words before finally speaking from the heart. We cannot erase what we did. We believed we were protecting our people, yet we failed to protect our own sister. Every day since you left, we have carried that regret. The youngest brother lowered his eyes. If forgiveness is impossible, we understand. We only wanted you to know that we finally see the pain we caused. Isabella felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. The bitterness she had carried since leaving Silver Ridge had gradually faded during her time in Shadow Crest. She understood that forgiveness did not erase the past. It simply refused to let the past define tomorrow. She stepped toward her brothers and smiled softly. I forgive you, but my future is no longer waiting behind me. It is waiting ahead. Her brothers nodded with quiet gratitude, accepting both her forgiveness and her decision. The council erupted into warm applause as leaders from both packs finalized a lasting peace accord founded upon transparency, shared trade, educational exchanges, and regular gatherings between the two kingdoms. Outside the castle, church bells echoed across the valley while villagers from both territories celebrated together beneath banners that no longer represented division but friendship. As evening approached, Ethan and Isabella stood alone in the castle gardens beneath the first rising stars. Ethan gently looked toward her before quietly saying, "There is only one promise left unfinished." Isabella smiled, already knowing exactly what he meant. Above them, the full moon slowly rose over the mountains, illuminating the ancient path leading toward the legendary moon tree where both of their journeys had always been destined to meet. The night of the moon blessing ceremony arrived beneath the brightest full moon either kingdom could remember. Hundreds of lanterns illuminated the ancient path leading toward the legendary moon tree, whose silver branches stretched across the peaceful valley exactly as they had appeared in Ethan Carter's dreams for so many years. Representatives from Shadow Crest and Silver Ridge walked together without fear, their banners carried side by side as music echoed gently through the mountain air. Families who had once believed they would remain enemies forever now shared smiles, conversations, and hopeful plans for the generations yet to come. Isabella Bennet slowly walked toward the moon tree, wearing an elegant white ceremonial gown embroidered with delicate silver thread, the same silver pendant resting over her heart exactly as it had in every drawing Ethan had created long before they ever met. As she reached the center of the sacred clearing, she looked around in quiet amazement. Every detail matched the dreams Ethan had faithfully recorded throughout his youth. The moonlight reflected across a peaceful lake nearby. White lilies bloomed beneath the ancient branches, and a gentle mountain breeze carried their fragrance through the gathering. Ethan stood waiting beneath the tree in his royal ceremonial attire, his calm blue eyes filled not with surprise, but with gratitude. When their eyes met, both of them understood without speaking that the forgotten promise had finally reached its fulfillment. Elder Miriam stepped forward with a warm smile before addressing everyone gathered beneath the moonlit sky. Many years ago, fear divided two kingdoms that were never meant to stand apart. Tonight we celebrate not only peace between packs, but the courage of two people who chose compassion when bitterness would have been easier. Quiet applause spread throughout the crowd before fading into respectful silence once more. Ethan gently reached for Isabella's hands and looked at her with complete sincerity. For many years I believed the woman in my dreams existed only to remind me what kind of leader I should become. I never imagined she would one day stand before me beneath this very tree. You were never brought here because you were a bargain, a sacrifice, or a prize to be claimed. Long before we knew each other's names, you inspired me to become the man worthy of meeting you. Isabella felt tears brighten her eyes as she smiled through overwhelming emotion. I believed my brothers had sent me away to lose everything that mattered. Instead, I found the place where I finally understood my own worth. You never asked me to become someone different. You simply gave me the freedom to become myself. Beneath the glowing branches of the moon tree, they promised to walk beside one another with trust, honesty, compassion, and unwavering respect. As the final blessing concluded, hundreds of white lanterns rose together into the night sky, while joyful cheers echoed across the valley. Daniel Bennett and his brothers watched with peaceful smiles, grateful that forgiveness had opened a future none of them believed possible. Merchants, healers, elders, children, and warriors from both kingdoms celebrated together as music and laughter filled the mountains until long after midnight. Later, when the ceremony quietly ended, Ethan and Isabella remained beneath the moon tree for one final moment. Looking up at the silver branches, Isabella softly laughed. You searched for me because of a dream. Ethan smiled warmly. No, I searched because every dream taught me to hope. Together they walked back toward the castle where both kingdoms now shared one future instead of two divided pasts, proving that even the deepest misunderstandings can be healed when truth replaces fear, forgiveness overcomes regret, and two faithful hearts choose hope every single day beneath the same enduring moon.